So which armies are looking like the strongest in Warhammer 40k right now? And what powerful tricks can they bring to the table? Let's talk through the top 10 strongest armies in Warhammer 40k in order of win rate. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k army strength. In this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the very top of the 40k meta right now. What are some of the scariest armies to see on the other side of the tabletop? When talking Warhammer army strength, there's a whole load of different ways in which you can measure it. For this video I'm going to go through in order of tournament win percentage, which while it has its limitations, I think is still a very nice rough and ready metric for determining overall army power. It generally represents the average player's experience with the faction, even if there might be some factions that are more or less able to go to the absolute top of the meta and win tournaments and things. For a bit of top level context, I thought we'd also look at actual event wins of big tournaments. They more highlight the armies that do well in the hands of a player who absolutely knows them inside out, and also seeing as it's kind of topical at the moment, like with the weakest armies, I'd also throw in the metric of the amount of selections they got at the World Team Championships. Loosely speaking, the more teams that choose to run a faction, the more confidence that people have that they have some role in the top competitive meta, even if in reality in team events there's quite a lot more going on with strategies for specific matchups and things. Finally, people's general enthusiasm for a faction can be seen by their play rate. The stuff that tends to be strongest and most interesting at the time tends to get played a bit more. That has to be taken in context of their normal player base. Some armies are just collected a lot more than others. As when I recently did the weakest armies in 40k video, which I'll link down in the video description, I'm broadly quite positive about game balance right now. Compared with a lot of times in the past where Games Workshop really has had things completely out of whack, it's better than the vast majority of Warhammer 40k's history. Currently no single faction is dominant like we had with Eldari and then Necrons in early 10th edition. I'd go as far as to say that at least every faction is playable casually if you're running a somewhat strong list and know what you're doing with it, though there are a few that feel like they're rather out of the running for more competitive play, and certainly some that we'll get onto that are a lot easier to win with than others if you know them well. Obviously there's always room for improvement, and some armies need some internal balance help as well as just buffs or nerfs. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if some of the armies at the very top of this list get points adjustments to rein them in a bit at some point. In any case, jumping straight into it, and before we get to the main top 10, these are some honourable mentions with the mid-tier on win rate. 6 armies on around about 49% and generally pretty well balanced. Here we have Imperial Knights, Adeptus Mechanicus, Tyranids, Leagues of Votann, Tau Empire and Black Templars. Quite nice to see quite so many armies right in the middle of the pack. How they get those win rates are a bit different though. I'd say out of these factions, in particular the Tyranids and the Tau Empire do tend to maybe be a bit more overrepresented in terms of actual tournament wins, whereas perhaps armies like Imperial Knights and Leagues of Votann might not break into the top tables of tournaments quite as much as some of the others, though obviously still have a lot of raw strength and tend to be particularly strong just with raw might, perhaps particularly in a less hyper-optimised setting. It's certainly cool to see the Tyranids doing quite so well again after their buffs. Otherwise though, let's move swiftly on to the top 10 by win rate, and first up we have Adeptus Custodes on 50%, realistically not significantly different at all to the previous ones on 49, but just a tiny bit more upper mid than some maybe. As with Imperial Knights, Adeptus Custodes tend to be a bit more of a stat check bully sort of army. Obviously can be played a lot better and a lot worse, but have a bit more of a skill ceiling compared with some perhaps. As a result, don't generally tend to be actually topping tournaments quite as much as some of the rest. They've only had one big event win in Pariah Nexus so far, and only 6 teams chose to take them at the WTC, which is pretty low compared with most of the rest on this list. They're sort of middling play rates at the moment, around 11th out of 26. In the last balance update, they got boosted quite a lot from being right down in the doldrums in terms of win rate. Shield Host got multiple big boosts to it. You get the damage boost every turn rather than just doubling down on a single turn. Shield Captains really enjoyed these stratagem changes, which now make them work a lot better with that detachment, and the Mortal Wound stratagem can defend against devastating wounds again. Between all that, that's pushed the Shield Host to be by far the most played detachment out of any of them, though weirdly enough, the only big tournament win that they've achieved so far was with someone running the Nor Maidens Task Force, which basically no one else is doing. Otherwise, for balance changes, a lot of Forge World stuff went down a bit, most of which I still feel is maybe a little bit mid, though the Venatari Custodians in particular got great. For 165 points for free rapid ingress and fast moving Custodians with a Lance keyword, they seem like a pretty much auto-include in competitive lists if you have access to them. Otherwise, to maintain the battle line, Custodian Wardens are often the way to go with their Feel No Pain and their damage debuffs. They can take a punch better than anything else, and might often get led by Blade Champions or maybe Shield Captains, and Custodian Guard often tend to be in the mix led by Kyria Draxus. We'll see whether or not that persists after the Imperial Agents Codex comes out. Otherwise throw in some Sisters of Silence, maybe a Calidus or Eversaw Assassin if you want to learn Operative, and then perhaps some Caladius tanks if you want some long-range anti-tank firepower. And between all that, there can be quite a lot of strength in a Custodes army. In general, it's quite nice to see them a kind of nicely mid-tier faction. For the rest of 10th edition, they've either been kind of overpowered or kind of weak, and not much in between. Moving up from gold to silver, and next up we have the Grey Knights. They're a tiny little bit better on the win percentage at 51%. Again, also just have the one big tournament win in Pariah Nexus so far. They were very overrepresented in the World Team Champion selections, with a huge 25 teams taking them. I guess perhaps partly due to a faction that can score well kind of regardless of matchup with all their teleport tricks, so it could be an army that you could rely on to lose by not too much if they were going into something that was a bit adverse. Otherwise, they're kind of similar sort of levels of play compared with normal, 19th out of 26. I feel like that's often where they tend to hang out for competitive play rates. For the last balance changes, the Dread Knight, Land Raider Redeemer and Castellan Crow all increased in points a bit, and there were some small nerfs to the Vortex of Doom and the Haloed and Soulfire stratagem. There seems to have been enough to drop them down a little bit from being one of the strongest factions in the game pre-data slate. They were on around about 55% wins there, and this does seem to have taken the edge off them a little. Beyond that though, army lists don't really seem to have changed too much. They're still making really quite heavy use of Dread Knights needed to destroy enemy heavies. Nothing else in the index does so quite as well, though I would say that basically everything else unique is more or less playable. Both flavours of Terminators and all the power armoured variants, though some a bit more than others. The Terminators often tend to get led up by Caldor Drago, or still Brotherhood Librarians are doing quite well, in spite of the Vortex of Doom nerf and the previous points increases. They can certainly be a very challenging and spooky army to fight, with access to so many redeploys and teleport shenanigans. Next up, and in 8th place, we have the Necrons, also on around 51% win rates, a bit more successful in the top tournament scene so far in Pariah Nexus, though they are played far more. 3 big event wins, but they are played 3rd out of the 26 factions given how popular they are from their 9th edition launch, and again they were very well represented at the WTC, with 23 teams taking some. The balance updates were broadly kind of bad news for the Necrons. Wraiths and Doomstalkers going up in cost, and that seems to have basically stopped Canoptech Court being the single strongest way to play. There's also no 3-inch Deep Strike teleport for Catan in Hypercrypt, though that detachment still seems to be the one that most people take in Pariah Nexus, particularly handy for all sorts of squads jumping about, doing actions and things. Again, like the Grey Knights, it's very hard to stop them scoring certain secondary objectives here, even if they have taken some other blows. In Hypercrypt, they often tend to build around super heavies, maybe monoliths or Tesseract vaults from time to time now, often backed up by some combination of death marks and hex marks for jumping around scoring objectives, perhaps some firepower like Doomsday Arcs or either flavours of destroyers, maybe some individual locusts for scoring type things, and still potentially running Catan for just some raw strength and muscle. They might have less deployment options, but they're still pretty deadly and durable for their points cost. Awakened Dynasty seems to be the next most played detachment now, with a few more core units and character combos in that whole thing. Overall, Necrons are doing at least fairly well still. A few of their lists maybe feel a little bit piecemeal and bitty though at the moment. I can't help but think it would be quite nice if they gave Warriors and Triarch Praetorians a bit of a new lease of life. I do feel like there's still quite a lot of units in Codex Necrons that aren't particularly regularly played currently. Next up, and ranking in 7th place on the win rates, are the Chaos Demons. They're also on 51% wins, so again are only very slightly ahead of anything else in the mid-tier. They've won 2 events in Pariah Nexus, are the 13th most played faction overall, but really weren't taken all that much by competitive teams at the World Team Championships, with only 4 teams taking some. There might have been a little bit of conflict between some armies taking allied demons along, but even bearing that in mind, people don't seem to be quite as convinced with them to go the distance against the best of the best. Still though, they certainly do seem to be able to win grand tournaments, and they have had a big power boost since the last balance update. Lots of points cuts to some things that were a bit lesser played, including a few things that were played a bit more, including Be'lakor, and the Bloodthirster went down a bit, and more importantly, Greater Demons now carry around a personal aura of Shadow of Chaos, So say a Bloodthirster can be used to deliver Khorne demons into close melee range, where you might have needed to rely on the stratagem to mark the midfield objective or Be'lakor before. As per previous, the greater demons are still really good. Maybe the Great Unclean One and the standard Bloodthirster with their normal enhancements in particular, they just feel like standout great value now. Pretty much everything else is solid though. Out of the demon flavours, maybe Khorne is in ascendancy more than the rest, Blood Crushers or maybe Bloodletters with character support, being delivered into close charge ranges, Fleshhounds are quite nice Outrider sort of units, and you can support them all with Remmasters, so in general just a lot more of the Codex feels playable compared with prior to the balance update. They did hit a few of the weakest things with some points decreases. Maybe the Flamers of Tzeentch or Plague Bearers of Nurgle feel like some of the other more solid choices for a bit of tricksy ranged firepower and some solid objective holders respectively. Overall feels like they're a bit stronger than pre-Data Slate, though still not quite as much top table performance as some of the rest here. Next up we've got Space Wolves placing in 6th. Their win rates are around 53%. They've won 2 big tournaments at Pariah Nexus so far, which if anything isn't really too bad given their play rate. They're really not played by all that many people, ranking 21st out of 26. I feel like maybe a slightly older model line, and their list in 10th edition having been a bit mono build with Thunderwolves up to now, maybe put people off a bit compared with some of the rest. They only got 5 selections at the WTC, though Divergent Chapter Space Marines have more competition than most. You can only take Space Marines once, and they were ranked mid in that. Most people taking Blood Angels by far, but a few more people taking Dark Angels than Space Wolves, which I'm sure the Sons of Rust won't be too happy about. For the last balance update, Thunderwolves and Wolfen both went up a bit by 10 points each per squad, though both of them still remain really quite solid units, but they did get their Champions of Rust formation buffed to the extent where it's genuinely a force to be reckoned with. Starting with one of the sagas active was quite a big deal, and basically flipped it from being a weak detachment into quite a good one. It now seems that people are very happy to play both Stormlance Space Wolves with all the Thunderwolf spam and Champions of Rust with the sagas, the Champions one not being quite as reliant on spamming Thunderwolves if you don't want to. They certainly still tend to go heavy on the Thunderwolves though, but might mix it up with a few more unique or generic Space Marine options in support. Jump Intercessors are often popular for a bit of skirmish melee as they are with the Blood Angels. Logan Grimnar often takes to the table for some big rerolls for a turn, and Wolfen still have scary stat lines for the cost. Overall, Space Wolves feel like they're in a pretty good place, though it seems that with the Thunderwolf point increase they have slipped a bit from their spot at the top of the game where they were leading the way win rates wise, though obviously they're really not too far behind. Still feels like tournament successes are a little bit few and far between, though that's probably partly due to the fact that they're played much less than most other armies. Next up, and in 5th, we've got the World Eaters. They've got win rates of 54% and seem to have risen up the rankings really quite well since the balance update. They've taken down 2 tournaments since, were played by a good number of WTC teams with 11 players there. They seem to be very unusually popular in the more general Grand Tournament meta, being the 7th most played faction. I think that's the most that World Eaters have ever been pretty much since they came out. The balance changes that they got were really quite simple. 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound both dropped in cost a little bit, though not crazily. It was maybe a slightly surprising change, as they were certainly being run already before. Our World Eaters were quite well balanced previously. It feels like it's maybe been enough to tip them from being roughly in the middle of the pack to being towards the front of it. For their more commonly run strong units, Angron is basically an auto-include territory, with the vast majority of competitive lists running him. Both sets of 8-bound tend to be run in very good numbers, maybe with Lord Invocators helping scout out some exalted ones if it makes sense. Jackals are generally handy to have in good numbers with sticky objectives, potentially tagging a home objective or some things early in the game after scout moves, and just being cheap expendable chaff. Berserkers and Rhinos are still solid enough, maybe with Khan or Master of Executions, and threatening to blood surge onto objectives, and then you can add some fire support if you want to. Their Forge Fiends are usable enough, or you could add some allied War Dogs, though maybe they're not quite as mandatory as some of them. In general, the World Eaters do seem to be in really quite a good place, really quite strong but maybe not at the absolute front of the pack, and pretty much all of their unique units genuinely powerful in game. I still wouldn't be too surprised if they might attract some sort of nerf next time round. Games Workshop might decide to push the 8-bound back a little bit closer to where they were before. Sticking with the Angry Red Space Marines, in 4th place we have the Blood Angels, also on 54% wins, though perhaps by all the other stats a bit more standout in terms of being one of the dominant armies in Pariah Nexus. They've taken down 5 big tournaments and were one of the top picked factions at the WTC with 19 selections, and that itself is pretty massive in the context of competing against all the other Space Marine chapters for selections there. They also seem to be very well played right now, with 10th out of 26 in terms of competitive game selections, and that's far beyond normal for them. It is interesting that they've risen up quite so much. They didn't get much changed in the balance updates, but I guess many stronger armies got nerfed, and it seems that their fast-moving jump unit, aggressive playstyle works quite well with the Pariah Nexus missions. As usual, achieving all their success with Sons of Sanguinius is really quite a powerful detachment, with the big damage buffs on the charge, +2 strength and +1 attack, and Red Rampage just to send one unit into overdrive each turn, plus a few helpful supporting melee tricks that can be really useful in the right situation. They kind of spoil for choice for viable jump infantry units to run with it. Death Company tend to be in big attendance, either with chaplains or the Martyrs himself. I guess soon to have a pretty radical shake-up though, when they're no longer able to field the Power Fist and Inferno pistols that they can in the Index. Otherwise, jump intercessors are strong, nice for skirmishing, and can be far more dangerous in Blood Angels. Assault intercessors in Impulsors, maybe with captains or sanguinary priests. I've seen plenty of people using other options like Vanguard veterans, Dante and Sanguinary Guard, or even Blade Guard veterans. The Sanguinor is quite a popular choice in himself as well, being able to heroic intervention from off the board to tip a key combat, and then just being a pretty dangerous lone operative from there. Overall, looks like the Sons of Baal are in ascendancy right now, one of the strongest armies in the game in the hands of a good player. They do have to make some big decisions and commitments as to what they can reach and wipe out in melee, and when they need to stay hidden. Moving on, and ranking in third in win rate terms, are the Adepta Sororitas. They appear to be on 55% win rates, and certainly seem to be taking the tournament scene by force, having the most tournament wins out of any of them, with 6 victories so far in Pariah Nexus. They were the second most played army in the World Team Championships, with 29 out of the 40 odd teams choosing to take them along, and perhaps unsurprisingly, after a strong and well received codex, their competitive play rate has surged a bit. They're still only 14th out of the 26 armies, though that is quite a bit more than normal. They are one of the more niche factions out there. The Sisters haven't had a balance update since their codex came out, and their points cost came out too. Their units generally went up in points to represent powerful new detachment rules and abilities, though obviously it doesn't seem to be hindering their strength. The vast majority of people are playing with Bringers of Flame, the one that gives you the advance and shoot and the extra strength up close, plus some pretty powerful transport shenanigans stratagems, a couple of damage dealers, and an Army of Contempt equivalent. Both Hallowed Martyrs and the Penitent Host seem to be doing pretty well as well. The Army of Faith may be trailing a bit with having the least success so far. In any case, the vast majority of the Sisters units are usable competitively in some capacity, maybe a bunch of things feeling borderline auto-include, though a lot of the rest still having some pretty good niche play. Perhaps for some of the most common staples, we've got the Castigator with its AP debuff shenanigans and nice ignores cover battle cannons, while a squad of Paragon Warsuits seem to appear in more lists than not. Not super hard to bring down for the points with the right firepower, but enough sheer damage to absolutely tear the heart out of an enemy list if they get a good turn in with all of their buffs and rerolls. For the core of the Bringers of Flame, Dominions and Immolators often seem the way to go. They can move forward incredibly quickly and bring the Melters and Flamers to the enemy early, plus Seraphim with a large amount of hand flamers, maybe led by a jump cannoness, pouring out the torrent devastating wounds. The Triumph of St. Catherine, despite its high points cost, seems to be one of the most auto-include units. Generating the Auto 6 Miracle dice is kind of massive. It does have plenty of useful buffs as well beyond that, such as the nice movement buff to get tanks moving forward extra fast if you need. Then to lead units, the Canonesses are both rather nice, the jump one and the foot one. The Dialogus is strong for auto 6s, or just being a cheap independent character, and Palatines can be a lot fighty than you might expect, and lethal hits can work interesting things with 6 miracles. Overall, the vast majority of the army isn't particularly tanky if they get exposed to enemy firepower, but if they can manage to get the Alpha Strike, then they can absolutely destroy things far more points than they are, and certainly can have some terrifying movement or annoying shenanigans on the go hiding behind terrain. They certainly feel like one of the armies challenging for best in game. Moving on though from some Cleansing Fire to Warp Fire, and in second place on the win rates we have the Thousand Suns, a big 56% wins in tournaments right now, and they were the single most played faction at the World Team Championships, 33 teams choosing to pick them up at the top level. There may be perhaps surprisingly few tournament placings at top events, given that their win rate's so good with only 2 event wins so far. though again I guess that might be partly down to a lower play rate than most. They're 18th out of 26. To be honest, I really wouldn't be too surprised if we see a bunch more tournament wins for the Thousand Sons over the course of the next few weeks though. For the balance changes they broadly got a bunch of their biggest shenanigans reined in. For the Kabbalistic rituals, maybe one of the most direct nerfs being to the cancel saves type 1, dropping down to just an AP2 boost in the shooting phase, but that's still really massive with Warp Flamers. At the same time as that though, they did get some points decreases as well, particularly the Mutalith Vortex Beast was one that went down kind of unexpectedly, perhaps switching from being a fairly commonly picked option to one that people are usually taking either one or two of in every list. Thousand Sons armies don't really have all that many units open to them, so the lists do tend to be a little bit cookie cutter. Magnus tends to be the central damage dealer in all of them, swooping around the table and obliterating things with his crazy magical firepower. Ahriman's usually leading a unit of Warp Flamers for +1 to wound and a free ritual, and then there's often a bunch of sorcerers in support on that of various different flavours, Infernal Masters being very popular for their devastating wound psychic attacks, and most of the sorcerers being escorted by Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers, maybe some in Rhinos. Then beyond all that and the Mutalith Beast, in Pariah Nexus there tends to be a little bit more emphasis on scoring chaff, maybe some Zangor Enlightened or some Thousand Sons cultists often being the way to go. Despite yet another points decrease, Scarab Occult still seem to be breaking through far less than the rest, perhaps still due to just coming with fewer Cabal points baked in, even if I feel like their stats and general abilities are pretty fine in anywhere but a hyper-optimised setting. Overall, still a pretty terrifying force to be contending with, and they do have some sneaky tricks as well, like being able to teleport units around late game with that Umbralific Crystal, can be one to go for some sneaky secondaries or even secret missions if it makes sense, and fighting the primary game against them can be tough with lots of Warp Flamers defending the midfield objectives. Finally, that just leaves us with one, and ranking first for win rate at the moment are the Drukhari. 40k's Dark Elves now climbing to significantly higher than their Craftworld cousins, and that has been a bit of a flip around since the start of the edition. Again, they're still an army that seems to be lesser played than most, at around about 20th out of 26 factions, though for them that's still far above normal. They usually tend to vie for one of the lesser played factions in the game in more normal times. Otherwise they've won 5 big events in Pariah Nexus so far, which is kind of huge for how often they're played. They compare with many were a bit lesser played at the World Team Championships as well, though there might be a little bit of an element of Inari stealing their thunder there. Quite a few teams ran a bunch of Drukhari under an Inari flag for all the battle host benefits. In the last balance update they didn't have too much crazy happen to them. Some small points buffs for Grotesques and Ravagers, a small nerf for Scourges, though perhaps some of the biggest changes for them were that their Archon's command point debuff got a lot nastier. They do tend to be the sort of unit that you want to throw right into the midst of the enemy army. They seem to get on pretty well with Pariah Nexus missions in general, lots of very fast moving chaff that can run around doing actions and can be hard to stop scoring. In general though, their index has been in a pretty strong spot since the Sky Splinter formation came out, Raiders and Venoms transporting the majority of the army about, maybe some big units of 10 Witches with Lilith jumping out of Raiders, or the same with Archons and Incubi, both of those can threaten to take down a lot of big stuff in the game. Then maybe backing up with some smaller squads of Incubi or perhaps some Kabbalite warriors in Venoms to swoop around doing objectives, nice and fast moving, expendable and still at least some threat. Mandrakes are pretty auto-include for some screening into the midfield, plus the ability to fade away and jump around and do secondaries. Scourges are really annoying to fight against, with their move shoot move being able to pop out, deal damage and jump back, and otherwise lots of other stuff is very good as well. Beastmasters to scout into the midfield, Ravagers for some heavy firepower, usually one Kronos to farm some pain tokens, though you could use more if you wanted. Overall, basically the vast majority of the index is pretty usable, though I'd say that these are maybe some of the most frequent staples. Overall, looks like it's a good time to be Dark Eldar in Pariah Nexus. Looks like they've not had a better chance to shine in 10th edition more so than now. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts as to what you'd rate as the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now. How have you found playing either with or against these armies in game currently? Look forward to hearing your takes. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and feel free to check out the counterpart to this video with the top 10 weakest 40k armies. That'll be linked down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to see more like this, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.